I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Kartik is a partner within Everest Group's global sourcing practice, which is focused on helping enterprises with workforce strategy decisions across sourcing models and locations. He also has a dedicated focus on global business services. Jamit Arora, partner, leads Everest Group's research offerings focused on enterprise executives in IT, sourcing and vendor management, and shared services. Vivek Bhatia is also a practice director within Everest Group's global sourcing practice and co-leads the GBS setup advisory around sourcing strategy, business case evaluation, and PMO support for setting up new global business services. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Jamit. Take it away, Jamit.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to this very global audience from a very hot and humid New York City. It's great to see a lot of familiar names in the attendee list. I know a number of you were actually on the webinar last week as well, which I had the privilege of also hosting, where we were focused on some of the transformational tenets of value creation and outsourcing. And then this week, it's literally the opposite, where we are going to focus on insourcing. Before we get further, I just wanted to take a quick minute to define insourcing. And in some ways, it is very easy. As I said, it is the opposite of outsourcing. And as you're thinking about it, it is actually the shift in service delivery from a third-party outsourced model to an in-house or global business service model. The key thing here is shift from outsourced to insourced. So if at some point an organization had decided to leverage external support and now they wanted to bring the service back in-house, that's what is insourcing. So having defined that, why are we talking about insourcing? And there has been a surge in some ways of companies looking to rethink services delivery and bring back operations in-house. And if you look at some of the names in front of you, and these are all public examples, what you'd find interesting is that these are companies that are operating across regions, and a few of them are really considered innovators in their field. And you have examples across banking, pharma, industrial. All of these are companies that are looking to reshape the service delivery continuum. And if you think about it, be it AstraZeneca, DBS, NAB, at some point, these companies realized that they might have swung the pendulum too far in the other direction, got too external, and are now looking to rebalance priorities and shift the control of services back in-house. And again, I use the word control, and I think that's absolutely key to this discourse today. This is an era of massive disruption, and there's a lot of transformation potential that exists. And companies that want to be in control of their technology and operations estate are kind of rethinking what it is that stays external, what it is that stays internal. As a bank, and this is something which a lot of banking executives have come out and said, hey, we happen to be a technology company with a banking license. So if that's how the company identifies itself, their approach towards who owns the core competence, that is technology, shifts radically. And so that is why we thought this context was important. That is why we think this topic is important. So as we move to the next thesis, and just to kind of set up how it is that we wanted to have the discussion today, I wanted to nominate myself for an award for being in a webinar, going through 2 slides in roughly 6 minutes without mentioning the pandemic, without mentioning COVID. Oops, I just said it. It was hard, but I think we have to acknowledge that the momentum that we saw in insourcing building up to 2020 got a significant shot in the arm due to what's happened because of COVID, and why clients are thinking to reimagine the service delivery. So what we wanted to do was to have a comprehensive examination of this insourcing topic. And the way we wanted to kind of structure the next 40 or so minutes was to talk through our convictions, our provocations, and controversies. And I know a number of you are familiar with this framework. So what we have for you today is 5 convictions, which are our foundational beliefs, and you can take these to the bank. Then we'll have 3 provocations and 3 controversies, right? So let's kind of dive straight into the first conviction. So conviction 1, we are in a pandemic environment and all of the BCP models got exposed, right? And enterprises today are taking a fundamental re-evaluation of the services model where all options are on the table at once. So what does this mean, right? To unpack this, let's look at some of the goals that companies have. Companies are trying to dramatically reduce costs. They're looking to lower their risk exposures and improve productivity. And as they're thinking about this, what we are seeing is a lot of different decisions that people are making, right? One GBS head described it to me as, and this was a couple of months ago. It feels like people are running around with their hair on fire. So that's the kind of situation you see, and what people are wrestling with is, hey, should we be doing more outsourcing or should we be outsourcing less? And by the way, part of the trigger here was the fact that internal models proved to be more resilient than third-party models. Second is, should we be consolidating our portfolio? And this would be across providers, locations, real estate, or should we be expanding and diversifying our risk by expanding the portfolio of choices? The third theme that came up, and this is a close cousin of insourcing, which is repatriation. And we saw this kind of happen early on. Some functions got repatriated onshore, especially contact center. So organizations are asking critically, hey, should we be bringing more work back onshore, or should we continue to expand offshoring because it helps lower costs? And then finally, we have this situation where companies are using this opportunity to double down on the GBS side of the equation, adding more scale, adding more captive locations, if I may, or global in-house centers. And on the other hand, as you will see with every economic crisis, and we're going to get to that in a second, there's a desire to see if there might be more opportunities to monetize and drive some capital infusion into the business. So here's the reality across your peers. All of these options are on the table at once, even within the same company. And where you are in the morning might be different as to where you are in the evening. And we are here to say that inherent dissonance is okay, because this is a unique opportunity to critically re-examine all of your assumptions. And last week we helped you re-examine your outsourcing assumptions, and this week we'll do the same for insourcing. With that, let's examine some of the forces that existed pre-COVID. And as I think through the statistics that we've put out here, the first stat, it's startling, or maybe not so startling. More than half of the enterprises that we've looked at, and every year we interview between 300 to 400 enterprises as part of our different outsourcing evaluations, and more than half are dissatisfied with their existing service providers. Now, that might not sound too extreme, but this was actually for reference customers, which is customers who are nominated by their providers to say, hey, we do a good job. These clients come in and they are non-promoters. So, Houston, we clearly have a problem with the outsourcing model. And then as part of our ongoing studies, we look at a variety of other metrics. We have an enterprise pulse series, the key issue surveys, and there's some other interesting stats to think through. About 1 in 4 enterprises expect the sourcing mix to change in favor of insourcing. About 1 in 3, so roughly 33% of the enterprises who either use a termination for convenience or cause route, they're not kind of taking it to another provider, but they are essentially bringing that service back in-house. And then fundamentally, if you think of share shifts, the GBS model has gone up significantly over the last decade. So where the share of the GBS model was 20%, a decade ago, that share has reached 27% in 2020. So a lot of foundational facts that you see which are promoting this tide towards insourcing. And as you kind of look forward and think of the trends in a post-COVID environment, we've been looking at a lot of clients, asking them the questions about how are you structurally thinking about reorienting your service model. No surprise, automation, process design came in as number one and number two, but number three was an eye-opener. Companies are thinking of moving more work in-house and driving insourcing to create incremental value. So, not only did we have this rising tide pre-crisis, the crisis seems to have strengthened the case for insourcing. Having established this, I would still like to kind of provide a cautionary note. So as we look at some of the data on the next slide, it's very important to be fact-based. And here's another mini conviction or a sub-conviction that I wanted to share here. Be prepared for headlines that are going to come up about companies wanting to pause or divest GBS operations. This happens after every crisis. It peaked during the 2008 to 2011 period, where we had many large-scale divestitures. So think of the Citi situation, AIG, as you would expect in an economic crisis. And if you look at the periods subsequently, so every subsequent 4-year period, the numbers come down, right? So from 30, it came down to 15 in the 2012 to 2015 period, came down to 9 divestitures in the 2016 to 2019 period. But we expect an uptick, right? And we expect to see some more big announcements to come through. And with that will be some press around, hey, this is the death of GBS, the death of GICs, the death of insourcing. Don't believe them. Because yes, these headlines are real, but some of the structural aspects which call for greater acceleration in the GBS setup will also happen, right? So with that, I'd like to kind of keep the conversation moving and talk through what might be some of the triggers for insourcing. Vivek, you wanna help us with what we think is going to drive that?
Sure, Jimmy. Great first conviction around all options are open, and I agree, all options are open, and all options must be evaluated. And just to add another fact, Jimmy, the first half of 2020, we've been seeing a relatively much more sustainable momentum in the number of publicly announced deals for insourcing in comparison to the divestitures. So that's the reason why we're doing still believe firmly that insourcing will continue irrespective of the divestitures or not. Talking about triggers for insourcing, right? The conviction here is that if you look at insourcing, the triggers are not very different from the triggers that you would see for a broader transformation at play in any enterprise. And therefore, it requires some bit of conviction and commitment to sort of also take the plunge. If you look right from the left, right, if you look at these triggers, the first spark that is normally at play is the dissatisfaction with the current outsourcing construct. Broadly, specifically around, hey, I'm not getting as much as I want to, I need more from less. The kind of statements that we normally hear from our enterprise clients saying, we're not getting as much innovation as we used to get. We're still facing troubles with the talent model when it comes to provider. So therefore, that's usually the first spark that sort of triggers, what are the other viable options in the mind of the enterprise stakeholders. The second one is the real deal clincher here, which is off late, there is a greater push for digital. And with that comes a realization that technology is no longer non-core for me. And these two sentiments are the often most cited reason why enterprise decide to look away from the outsourcing and look for reasons either in-house or move it to the GBS model. The other two reasons on the right-hand side are generally favorable or result into what we call as incremental insourcing. So for example, broader risks related with outsourcing. And as the pandemic has shown, the need to strengthen the resiliency, whether it's a location resiliency or the BCP resiliency. So these 5 put together are the key triggers. But hey, let's hear from the audience. And with that, let's move to our first poll questions. All right, the first poll question is a relatively simpler one. We want to hear from you, what's the primary trigger for insourcing? And there are 4 options. We'll keep the poll open for about 30 seconds. The 4 options are: do you think the primary trigger for insourcing is dissatisfaction from your current outsourcing constructs? Do you think it's generally a part of broader digital transformation agenda, and so therefore it's independent of any other 3 reasons? You believe it's the broader concerns with the regulatory and BCP resiliency that will shift the tilt towards insourcing? Do you think it's the business and cost pressures that will pave the way for insourcing trend? Okay, we'll keep the poll open for another 5 seconds.
Yeah, Vivek, this is an interesting poll question. Let's see what the audience has to say. Obviously, it is a combination of all these reasons. Okay, interesting. What I find particularly interesting is most of the audience believes that insourcing is part of the broader digital transformation agenda, and that's the way it should be. It's the broader enterprise strategy and the levers of value that should drive insourcing versus outsourcing. Not very surprised at results of option number 1 as well. As Jimit and Vivek, both of you have mentioned, clearly there is a concern around outsourcing not delivering, the required value additions. Okay. So
right.
with that, let's move on. Right. So Vivek has talked about, what are the triggers for insourcing, and as Jimit mentioned, the current crisis has strengthened the value proposition for GBS organizations, particularly around resiliency. And also this piece about the GBS being viewed as an integrated strategic partner for the enterprise. Now, what you see on this slide are key differentiation levers for a GBS around, access to high skill capabilities, the concept of a GBS, if run well, being seen as a truly integrated partner, right, both culturally and strategically. And the fact that the GBS helps drive an end-to-end view and a consolidated view. Consolidated, we mean across multiple functions, the GBS driving innovation. And as Jimit said earlier, typically most of the GBS have been able to demonstrate considerable resiliency, not just with their own operations, but they've also helped the broader enterprise achieve a lot of resiliency. And that's going to provide a significant boost to insourcing, or at least a trigger to enterprises thinking about insourcing decisions. Let's now move on and say, okay, this all seems like insourcing should be fairly easy, but is it that easy? What are the key pitfalls? What are the key challenges? And our conviction here is insourcing is definitely easier than before. However, as in most cases, execution will eat strategy for breakfast. So why is insourcing easier than before? Just to move on. A lot of the traditional entry barriers to insourcing have reduced considerably. So what are these typical barriers? First is that it is a lot easier to set up a GBS now than before. There is much better access to quality leadership now. This is not just an India view, but you could be looking at it in the Philippines, Central Eastern Europe, Latin America, pretty much all key what you may say as nearshore destinations, offshore destinations. There is a robust services ecosystem, and because many companies have done this, there is an access to a peer group, right, that new companies can look to learn from, and a better understanding for legal and regulatory environment. Done well, and with the right commitment and focus, it is possible to actually get a GBS up and running in 6 months from the time a go-ahead is received. Now, this journey used to take much longer before, upwards of 12 months. But if you do this well, it's a lot easier and a lot faster to set up a GBS. The second is there's always been this view that, if you could stay on the previous slide, there's always been this view that scale is a huge barrier, that you can't set up a GBS unless you have 2,000 people, 3,000 people. The concept of scale being essential for success has gone out of the window. And in fact, even if you have a scale of 200, 250 people, you can actually break even at 50 to 80 FTEs. The critical thing to think about is how can GBS tie in with the broader value proposition of the enterprise? Even for small scale GBS, and that leads us to the third barrier here, you can achieve impact in shorter time as long as you've got the strategy right and you're thinking about how the GBS ties to strategic value for the enterprise. So the time to maturity is shortened. Typically, it used to take 8 to 10 years, in my own experience, from a GBS to set up and become a true value-added partner. But guess what? A lot of the new GBS now are setting up with a value orientation in mind. And how can they do that? With better alignment on strategy. There is a lot of partnerships they can leverage with external ecosystems. And we've seen on an average about a 15% increase in the share of judgment intensive roles. And that really helped achieve a shorter time to maturity. The last concern has always been that, look, I don't have experience doing this before, so is it actually going to be a lot more challenging? Well, partially that's true. Close to half of the GBS set up in the last 3 years were by enterprises that are setting up their first GBS, and the access to the whole ecosystem, be it peers, specialist knowledge, people who've done this before, advisors. So the entry barriers to outsourcing have decreased, which basically means that insourcing is easier than before. Which, if you go to the next slide, however, planning for this is very easy, right? You can make a very good strategy, you can come up with a robust implementation plan. However, the execution is the challenge. So just to move on, here is how we've seen companies successfully execute insourcing, and this is coming from our own experience helping companies do this. And as I talk through this, I'll talk about some best practices and also pitfalls. The first thing is to evaluate whether insourcing is the right decision. So just because 5 of your peers have done it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right decision for you. And later on in this webinar, we're going to talk about situations where insourcing is not the right approach. The second piece is align on what is it that you're doing insourcing for, right? Is it to achieve lower cost? Is it to achieve greater productivity? Is it to achieve greater value? Be very clear on outcomes and expectations, not just for the long term, but also for the short term. So you need to be clear in saying, okay, first 3 months after I insource, what am I going to expect? 6 months later, what am I going to expect? A year later, what am I going to expect? The third is, as insourcing will involve, some aspect of, or will involve a significant aspect of rebalancing from the vendor, handling that whole communication process with the vendor and securing transition support from the vendor is very critical, because enterprises need to see the vendors as partners in this journey. Obviously, it's going to negatively impact their business, but finding ways to involve them successfully in this journey. Because one of the examples we've seen is, although a service provider lost out in that particular part of the insourcing, the enterprise looked to provide other opportunities in other parts of the enterprise for the same service provider. So the overall relationship was maintained, right, where some work was in-house, insourced, some work was outsourced as well. So securing the right transition support from the vendor. Very important decision. How much do you want to rebadge versus building talent? Now, enterprises need to understand the pros and cons of both. So rebadging gives you a faster time to market, because you've got the same pool that's been servicing the client before. Having said that, you're looking to build a very different culture. So what are some areas where you're really thinking about wanting to build that? So we've seen a number of scenarios in insourcing. One where companies have said, look, no, I don't want to rebadge any talent. I want to build completely new. In other situations where it's been 100% rebadging, over a period of time, move towards a blend of rebadge versus building talent. That is a very, very critical decision, and companies should not assume that insourcing necessarily means complete rebadging. Now, transition and employee communication. Now, this is no different from any outsourcing relationship, but here, really thinking through what is going to be the strong value proposition for the employee to move from a service provider to the GBS or to the enterprise. Because you've got to think about it not just in the context of immediate switching, but also in the context of what is the broader value proposition. In one of our recent client examples, the thing that really worked out well was the company really set out a very clear career path for the rebadged employees, saying, it's not just about, moving to the enterprise of the GBS, but what that career path is going to look like, for the next 2 to 3 years. So designing that very strong value proposition is important. Then we talk about cultural integration. This is where we see many insourcing journeys fail, because you can rebadge the people, you can look to rebadge processes, technologies, etc. But then realize that there is a massive cultural difference. So how do you build that cultural integration? And investing in the right leadership with both the GBS and the enterprise in ensuring this is going to happen is absolutely important. And then monitoring and stabilizing, as I said earlier, defining the right metrics. Success metrics will also set the right expectations. So you may not get success from day one, but you've got to have realistic goals. Maybe for month 1 it's about stabilization. Your month 3 to month 6 it could be about improvement in productivity. Month 6 onwards it could be about accelerated value addition. So you've got to think through all of that and think through all of that right up front, so that this journey is smooth for everybody. Now, insourcing obviously provides benefits, and also there's been a question as well that's been asked to us around what are the benefits with insourcing. Vivek, do you want to take it on from here?
Yes, thank you, Karthik. So having decided then the reasons for why you want to do insourcing, and also having planned and executed well, we can move to the next conviction, which is all about the benefits, which is the sweeter aspects. So successful insourcing.
Yeah, successful.
Sorry.
Before we get to the next conviction, right? I talked about a number of challenges in this insourcing journey. Would like to get to the audience view on what do they expect to be the biggest challenge in the insourcing journey. Is it about identifying when and what to insource? Is it the likely disruption that I spoke about? Could it be about not having the right capability to manage in-house delivery? Securing the right leadership support at the enterprise? And is it about the investment required? So what does the audience see to be the biggest challenge in the insourcing journey? Okay, this is interesting. I both agree. I agree with the sentiment that the capability to manage in-house delivery is likely to be the biggest challenge. In my experience, item number 1, also thinking through when and what to insource is also a significant challenge. Okay, Vivek, I guess that's a good segue to the next conviction around what are the real benefits for insourcing. Can you talk about your experiences here?
Sure, and I think it sort of follows from a successful execution The most recent one that we helped one of our enterprises successfully insource in an accelerated time frame. Successful journeys will vouch for a podium finish and will entitle the enterprise for Olympic tag, becoming Citius, Altius, and Fortius. Now, what does that mean? Moving on, Citius as the literal translation means swifter. And here what we're trying to say is enterprise will likely become more agile and customer-centric by leveraging insourcing. And as is evidenced by a number of enterprises from across the verticals, whether it is about making the internal IT teams more agile, faster internal turnarounds, or it be about faster speed to market and being more responsive to the end customer, or it is about making sure that your NPS and customer experiences, whether it's the internal or the external customer, improves. So a number of examples where we've seen an increase in the NPS scores and faster turnarounds. Altius means higher, and effectively in this context, insourcing can be leveraged to add new digital capabilities. And as an example, a leading consumer goods enterprise effectively leveraged insourcing and set up an innovation lab to spur digital innovation and invest in new capabilities around virtual reality, 3D printing, and robotics. The final benefits around Fortius, which implies becoming stronger, is evidenced by a number of players prominently come out and vouch for the success of insourcing. For example, leading healthcare enterprise cut down its total IT spending by 50% over 3 years by embarking on a large-scale insourcing journey. Another leading digital Asian bank has consistently improved its cost-to-income ratio year on year by embarking on a massive insourcing transformation journey, which saw its IT outsourcing shift from 85% outsourced to about 90% insourced. Having said that, these benefits do seem lucrative, but they are premised on a single factor, and that is insourcing needs to enable a mindset shift from delivering non-core services, which means that there has to be an underlying set of ingredients, right ingredients in place to enable or unlock those benefits. So therefore, insourcing needs to enhance cross-functional collaboration. It also needs to ensure that there's a tighter integration between enterprise, a better control, governance, and a risk framework. And also a clear clarity on what's core and what's non-core, which means housing some of those core capabilities closer to the business functions and making sure there is customer proximity. So that brings us to the end of the fourth conviction. And I would like to ask Jimit, having heard us for the last 15 odd minutes, how does Jimit see these conversations playing out in the boardroom?
Yeah, thanks, Vivek. And it's surprising, I'm not usually considered the voice of balance and reason, but guess that's the role I'm playing today. So if we just back up and think about it, we established that, hey, enterprises are rethinking the model, all options are on the table at once. There's multiple reasons for which insourcing is being considered. We believe it's a lot easier than before. However, execution is key. And then if you do it well, you emerge faster, better, stronger. Can you stay on the previous slide for a second? Yeah. However, the key thing to recognize is insourcing does not mean no outsourcing, right? And we want to make sure that we don't come across as, hey, this is a one-size-fits-all approach. And just like you have with everything in this world, looking forward to the models that we had up in front of us before on the next slide, this is going to be a hybrid world, right? And when we say that, like with everything today, cloud, talent, real estate, we are thinking of different shapes and forms of hybrid. The analogies of, hey, here's a public cloud, here's a private cloud, has transitioned to public talent, public crowd. Same's going to happen to real estate. It's been happening in sourcing for a period of time. And it is going to be a spectrum. So on the one hand, there is the pure GBS model. On the other hand is the pure outsourcing model. What's interesting is that we've always had a fair number of models that are in between, the assisted model, the joint venture, the BOT. Here's what I find fascinating, by the way. A number of these are really old-fashioned concepts, such as the BOT, but they're now coming back in vogue. We are relearning some of the things we were doing 20 years ago, right? And clearly there are pros and cons across each of these, and I won't unpack all of them, given that you'll have been examining this. But there's three things that I wanted to kind of call out. Control and cultural alignment, that usually is a big determinant of whether you stay to the left or move to the right? And that's one of the knobs that companies are thinking through to determine whether something is internal or external. Time to market, that has a role to play, and we've seen that as something that's favored outsourcing. And then governance is hard across the table. So all in all, right, let's be clear, insourcing does not mean a binary, it's the end of outsourcing. The future will be hybrid, and we want people to kind of keep that concept in mind. As we look at, and again, here are some examples from some of our clients who we've been working with, and I'll let you read the quotes yourself, but just to kind of think through the high level sentiment of the reason where people think about what stays internal, what goes external. Talent, strategic differentiation, critical core competencies, all of those are things that we've seen are reasons that people are looking at from an internal perspective. Culture is very important as well, but I like really the quote on the top right from the retailer, which is, we don't see the outsourcing model as being challenged, but we think it's going to change slightly in nature. And the things that can truly make a difference will be developed in-house. And I think that truly captures the sentiment of how we think the world going forward. With that, that's the end of the convictions. We want to jump to the provocations quickly, but we had an offer for all of you, primarily, the folks who are running GBS organizations. We have a maturity assessment, which gives you instantaneous results. So it's a survey, you fill it out, but you get an instant diagnostic, which also includes recommendations. So in the chat link, you will find the link to this. So at a later point, if you wanted to take this assessment, we'd be happy to make sure that we also do a personalized debrief for you. So with that, let's skip to the provocations and have a bit of fun. And again, I'm being the voice of reason, surprise, surprise. First one, insourcing seems attractive, but it doesn't mean it's the right answer for you. Same way, the model is going to be relevant, but don't assume that insourcing works for everyone. So let's kind of think through why, right? If your existing organization is not ready to deliver, don't add on new scope. If the type of work is not suited to insourcing, in fact, we just did a lot of work recently, not just looking at, hey, what are the types of work that are more suitable to insourcing versus outsourcing, how much of that is suitable to remote versus work from home. So there's different models, and then there's a lot of context in here. But if the type of work is not suited, or hey, if you're actually satisfied with what your providers are bringing to the table, leave it in that model, right? And then, in the poll, we had some of the challenges that people cited. How do you really create the buy-in? How do you really reconcile with some of the other levers? So keep in mind, it's a big wave, but it's not a one-size-fits-all where you want to apply it to all functions across all regions, right? So that's the first provocation. As we move forward,
Yeah. Okay, so the second provocation is also in the same vein, and it's a reminder to all of us that let's not lose sight of forest for trees. And as you embark on this journey, there are going to be a lot of bottlenecks during the execution. There are going to be people moving to different roles, to different organizations, and it's very easy to lose sight. So the second provocation is a reminder that insourcing is not an end in itself, but rather a means to unlocking greater benefits that go beyond just addressing the short-term benefits challenges. So effectively, enterprises need to be thinking consistently and rigorously, if it means framing this slide and keeping it in the boardroom, in the GBS that they're looking to set up, so be it. But it's in fact very important to remind that is insourcing being leveraged to unlock these benefits, the broader transformation agenda for the enterprise, which means how is insourcing being leveraged to just change the nature of the work itself? Are we leveraging the benefits of hyper automation and AI-enabled services to serve our internal and external customers better? What changes talent do we need to make to the talent operating model to increase the enterprise agility? How do we enable the new GBS setup that we've just looked at, just set up, drive global ownership and innovation? And lastly, but most importantly, how does that address the most important need of the enterprise in today's time, which is to strengthen the resiliency and by using next generation levers such as work from home? So these four should never be lost sight of and therefore are very important for any enterprise. Karthik, what do you think insourcing, how can insourcing unlock the aspects related to talent?
Before we get to the next provocation, right, let me just add an example from a client experience here. One of our clients went through the insourcing journey, Vivek talked about getting the podium benefits. What they really achieved is to set up the insourced GBS as a COE for global innovation. So they were able to do many more things in terms of developing new analytic tools, driving digital techniques, enabling transformation. Now that's a good segue to the third provocation that we had. At the end of the day, right, this is about a talent game, and I spoke about earlier one of the pitfalls being thinking about how much to rebadge and how much to hire yourself, right, or build versus buy decision. But irrespective of whether you build or buy, insourcing provides a great opportunity to reimagine the talent model and to look beyond the immediate benefits. So immediate benefits are obviously, you've got greater control, you can drive greater cultural integration. But if you think more medium term to long term, these are four opportunities to completely reimagine the talent model through insourcing. The first is around outcome orientation. Now, this is often a challenge in a service provider outsourcing construct because the service provider may be doing part of the work. You may have a challenge to linking things to outcomes. But once you move work to a GPS and you're tightly integrated, you could even think about aligning full business outcomes to the GBS scope of work. So what do we mean by business outcomes? Thinking about increase in customer satisfaction. When I say customer satisfaction, end customer satisfaction. Looking at speed to market for new products. So there are different ways in which you could actually drive outcome orientation that impacts talent model in terms of how they operate. Cross-functional learnability and trainability. Because the GBS provides a great opportunity to view things consolidated under one roof, you've got a unique opportunity to now think cross-function. So we've seen many banks structure the GBS teams around products. So you have a life insurance team that combines tech and ops, or you may have a reconciliations team that combines tech and ops. So those are some unique opportunities to drive cross-functional learning, collaboration that you get through a GBS model. Agility and entrepreneurial mindset. So we're not talking about agile development here. We're really talking about the speed that you can generate to adapt to new things. And Jim had said, let's not talk about COVID, but I will be forced to talk about COVID here. So COVID-like changes. The insourcing, or if done well, the GBS model provides that forum to drive agility. Entrepreneurial mindset that again links to innovation that I spoke about. Customer centricity. So we've seen, once you have the GBS model well integrated, enterprises invest a lot to help the GBS actually understand what the journey of an end customer is going to look like. We know of one GBS that does a lot of work in developing engineering for aircraft engines, they actually go through flight simulation experiences for their employees to help really understand what does this really mean. So you've got all these unique opportunities to reimagine the talent model through insourcing. So don't just think about it as a lever to drive, better control, as Vivek spoke about, faster, swifter, stronger. But you've got a new opportunity to rethink the talent model itself. Okay. With that, let's really move on and talk about, we covered the provocations, we talked about convictions and provocations. In all of this, there are several controversies. The one that Jimit talked about up front. Will insourcing continue to sustain its momentum that we've seen over the last 3 to 4 years, or will the pendulum swing the other way due to the crisis? The answer is always going to be somewhere in between, but there are different pulls and pushes on either side, so it's going to be something that we're going to be watching as well. The second is, will insourcing be accompanied by reshoring? So what we mean by here is, does insourcing mean moving from, let's say, an offshore, nearshore service provider kind of delivery to an equivalent offshore, nearshore GBS? Or is this also going to be accompanied by reshoring, which may mean moving work closer to the business, right? And there are reasons why it could happen, reasons why it couldn't happen. So that's the other controversy. The third is, how does the increased adoption of the work from home model, how is that going to impact insourcing? You could build a case that says insourcing gives a more foolproof model for resiliency. At the same time, a great part of the success for insourcing is going to be things around culture, things around driving tighter integration, which are much harder to do in a work from home model than in an office model. So is there going to be a temporary lull before things settle down? How's the market going to move? That's the other controversy. We're going to be examining these controversies in our research, and stay tuned for more of our research and points of view on this topic. Just to move on, just a couple of things before we move on to taking some very good questions that have come today. As Jimit and Vivek mentioned earlier, for those of you who are interested, we've got a short GBS maturity assessment survey, which has been posted on the chat panel as well, or you could revert back to us later. This is a quick survey, a directional survey that gives you an instantaneous output on how your GBS maturity compares to the industry, and also throws up some directional recommendations on things you could be thinking about. So for those of you who are interested, just to be clear, this is only for enterprises in GBS, given the context of the survey. Just one other sort of housekeeping item before we move on to the questions. I know there have been quite a few questions that have been asked, but for those of you who still have questions to ask, you could use the chat panel at the on your console and ask us any questions. We've got about 10 minutes. We'll try and address as much as possible, and for those we're not able to cover today, we will address that separately. So Jimit, I know you've been tracking some of the questions that have come during the webinar.
Sure.
To now moderate this.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think there's been some interesting debate also kind of that started in the Q&A. I think we've ruffled a few feathers, as I was hoping. So let me start off with one question, and Karthik, I'm going to direct this to you, which was more around, you'd mentioned earlier that, hey, it's getting easier for us to be able to set up a center, and conventional wisdom seemed to suggest, hey, if you have a minimum of 500 resources, 500 FTEs for an offshore GIC or captive, that was the limit. Anything beyond that was subscale. So how is it that we are seeing a 50 to 80 FTE center be viable?
Okay, so let me clarify that comment, right? Let me take two examples of clients where we have helped set up GBS in the last 1 to 2 years. In both those situations, the targeted end state scale, meaning after 3 to 5 years, is less than 300 people. And the reason why they've, again, it's 2 years into their journey, they're still successful because they have a very clear value proposition in terms of the kind of work they want to do. So one of them is doing some very complex, algorithmic trading analytics work. The other is doing some high-end finance and risk work for the broader enterprise. So having clarity on what you want to deliver and what value is going to be. Yes, the quantum of cost savings will be lower than if you have a large scale center. But guess what? Quantum of cost savings, even with a small scale center, are attractive enough, right? So you're really thinking about, is the differential going to be, 50% versus 40%? Now, 40% is still pretty attractive. I don't think a center of 50 to 80 in the end state is going to be viable. The reason is you also need a minimum scale to be successful in terms of attracting talent and having a brand. The point we were making is, to clarify, a minimum scale of 200, 250 can be viable. If you work through the economics of that, even at 50, you can break even. So that's the point we're trying to make. But we see a minimum scale being 150 to 200, right? Or somewhere in the 200 to 250 range. And there's also changes by location. So the dynamics of a market like India or Central Eastern Europe could be very different. So in Central Eastern Europe, 200 to 300 is the typical scale of centers as well.
Yeah.
The broad point to make is don't go on. The enterprises should not fall into this trap and say, unless I have multiple thousands, GBS is not something for me to consider. That's the point we want to make.
Understood. And this questions kind of come up in different shapes and form. And I know, Karthik, we've modeled this out before as well, which is the classical business case comparison, right? So does insourcing always have a higher operational cost compared to outsourcing, both in the short term and the long term? So how do you break that debate?
Okay, for clients that have done well, right, insourcing has actually achieved lesser costs on a total fully loaded basis compared to outsourcing. The reasons for that are follows, right? One, it also depends on how you've structured the outsourcing previously. But I talked about the outcome orientation, driving more cross-functional leverage that has actually helped companies achieve a fair bit of productivity saves, right? With one of the pharma companies, they grew the GBS headcount compared to insource by almost 50%. But in aggregate, they achieved in excess of $200 million savings despite the increased headcount. That's really because of the benefits of higher productivity and the construct of the model itself. Now, having said that, in the short term there will be an increase in cost, but done well, as Vivek also mentioned, it can result in significant cost savings. But I want to underscore, if it's done well.
Yeah. And I'd also add that one of the other themes which kind of is going into the business case right now is, yes, there is a very tangible need for comparable cost profiles. But if you go back to some of the discussions around strategic differentiation, how you start to impact certain top line initiatives, right? And then the competitiveness of those as you overlay some of these variables which don't tend to lend themselves to very quantitative analysis, the business case kind of proves out to be more compelling, right? A couple of quick ones that I wanted to kind of address very, very rapidly. I think we had some examples of the likes of AstraZeneca, DBS, and some folks were saying, hey, we seem to be hearing more about some of these names increasing outsourcing as well. And I think that's not inconsistent with what we are saying. In some cases, there'll be a statement which is, hey, we are going to go from one model entirely. So from an 85% outsourced to an 85% internal. Yes, we absolutely expect to see that. In fact, we expect to see that accelerate. But at the same time, as we said in the fifth conviction and the first provocation, it's not for everyone, and insourcing does not mean no outsourcing. So I think we are going to see examples even within the same company of having some inconsistent behaviors, right? I'd say, and maybe this is the last question that we can touch upon, and this is more in terms of any quick examples that we might have of services that are more amenable to the internal model or insourcing versus outsourcing. Vivek, Karthik, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can take that, Jimit. So based on the work that we've done recently and also based on the market precedents, you would tend to see more insourcing happening in technology domain, technology services. That's primarily also because traditionally speaking, technology has been outsourced more. We said in one of the convictions that what work, how you decide what work gets insourced is also a function of realization, what you consider as core to the business. And that's where the construct around the digital services, whether it's be automation transformation, whether it's be just moving to cloud and therefore retaining the architecture strategy work in-house, that's where it comes in place. Having said that, we also have examples of organizations, enterprises moving work that impacts the customer experience. So the like of infrastructure help desk services, the likes of contact center work, which directly impacts the net promoter score for the internal customers as well as for external customers. That work also can be insourced and be based purely on the on the premise that they want to, hey, we want to improve our net promoter score.
Perfect. Thanks, Vivek. Hey, that's probably all the time we have for today. Thank you for being an engaged audience. Look forward to answering some additional questions that we might not have been able to offline. I just wanted to remind everyone of some of the resources that you have available to you. Yes, we've been tracking what's been happening with the world of COVID-19 and how it's been impacting the world of services delivery in the IT BPO space from a locations dynamic tracker perspective. So you'll see a link to that, right, in the resources question. So thanks again, and Joy, back to you.
Thank you so much to Vivek, Jimit, and Karthik, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you will receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with a link to download the presentation slides along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. On behalf of Everest Group and our presenters, thank you so much for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.